Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I am Brian Ritter. I am the Executive Director for the Mercury Chamber Orchestra, and we're so thrilled that you're joining us this afternoon, perhaps on this unusually cold Houston afternoon. We are pleased you're taking some time out to join us for our virtual pre-concert talk with Greg Barnett. We're very excited about our concert this weekend on Saturday, February 13th. Where we'll be exploring music by Vivaldi and Handel, as well as others. And it's a great pleasure to turn things over to Greg to give us some insights into the music. So take it away, Greg.
Thank you, Brian, and welcome to everyone. I intend to conduct my remarks with the help of PowerPoint to show you some images and maybe play you a little bit of music. So I'm going to share my screen. What you should be seeing, if the technology is working both at your end as well as mine, is two portraits of two Italian composers whose names are, just by chance, very similar. Corelli and Torelli, two 17th and early 18th century violinist composers. And I'm starting with these two people, even though they're not on the program, because of an initial question that I want to address, which is, what is a concerto? And then related to that, how does it come to be? And these two Italian violinist composers establish the norms of the instrumental concerto as we know it and as we'll hear it on the pieces of this program. Now, to give you some background into that word in Italian use, and even more narrowly in Italian musical use, you can go back to the second half of the 16th century and find the word concerto in various contexts dealing with music. And in those contexts, it comes out as a fairly generic term for group, ensemble, consort. How it comes to be applied to music comes from, there are a number of arguments or hypotheses. That is, the word concerto, which is a noun, concertare, which is a verb, concertante, which is a participle. This word had an even broader meaning, but it was sort of vague to mean either to work in concert, as we would say in English, or to compete against one another, to strive or to compete. But in its most generic use that we can see from the late Renaissance, concerto just means ensemble. And then related to that, it means scoring or arrangement, even addition. And that's how this word has been circulating in Italian musical usage for about a century, until we get toward the end of the 17th century, and it begins to be applied specifically to ensembles of musical instruments. In this case, what I've highlighted here is on the title page of this collection of music, we're talking about vocal and instrumental ensembles. So early on, concerto is very broad in its meaning, but by the late 17th century, we begin to get the evidence of a much more specific use of the term, and a more specific use of the term that leads to what we understand as specific compositional types, genres of music. So here's where Giuseppe Torelli comes in, and this is the only place he'll come in. His Opus 5, which is instrumental music, but it's divided between what he calls symphonies, sinfonie in 3 parts, contrapuntally, and concerti in 4 parts contrapuntally. So 3-part symphonies, 4-part concerti. And what he then says to the performer of these pieces throws into relief the distinct idea that he has in mind for concerto in particular. And what he says is, look, if you want to play these concerti as I had in mind in order to discover my intention, you would do well to multiply all of the instruments. That is, for each part in the score, rather than use one instrument, which is typical, use multiple players per part, and then you'll have my idea of a concerto. So this is related to the older ensemble and arrangement or scoring idea, but it's now much more specific. Multiplied parts make a concerto. Well, moving on from Torelli to Corelli, who was much more influential in the history of the concerto and in the history of violin music. Corelli developed a specific type of concerto that he called the concerto grosso, which just means big group, big consort, or big ensemble. That's what it means in Italian. But then when you read the fine print, which I've translated here, the fine print says, these concerti grossi are for a smaller ensemble of 3 players. The smaller ensemble is called the concertino, the little group, and it comprises 2 violins and cello. Soloists, just 3 bodies playing 3 instruments, make up the concertino. And that's important. Hence, it's called obbligato. You can't play these pieces without the concertino. But then the concertino is combined with a larger group, which is also called concerto grosso, the larger group. And that is ad libitum. That is, you can combine, you can add in a larger group with this essential concertino if you want to, if you have the number of players to do it. And that larger group comprises 2 violin parts, viola, and accompanying bass. So it's a 4-part ensemble. But then here's what relates Corelli's thinking to Torelli's and the earlier history of the concerto. He says the parts in this concerto grosso may be doubled or even multiplied. That is, when you get into expanding your ensemble by doubling or multiplying players per individual written part, you do that to the concerto grosso. And the significance of this is that Corelli is writing a piece of music that ultimately is meant to show off the contrast in sound, the contrast in sonority between the smaller group and the larger group. It's that contrast that drives the concerto grosso in Corelli's conception of it. And this is about sonority, ultimately. It's not about thematic contrasts. In fact, the 2 groups here, the smaller group and the larger group, are usually reinforcing one another, maybe echoing one another, entering into kind of dialogues, so that they're not contrasted thematically. It's just the sonority. It's a game of sonorities. And this leads us, this was the fine print that I translate there, but this leads us to contemplate, all right, if we know what the concerto is or how it is developing as an instrumental genre of music, what was it used for? Why is it so important to multiply parts? And the answer to that question would be vast. But I can give you an idea from an illustration of Corelli's music making in late 17th century Rome. And specifically, what you have here in this image is the depiction of a large procession. And the procession is leading to a place, and that place is on the right-hand side of the image. The procession is leading to a concert, or actually, what the words are saying here is, this is a public celebration in the so-called Piazza di Spagna, which if you're a Rome aficionado, this place is where the Spanish Steps are currently located in Rome. But this is before the Spanish Steps were built. So it's just the Piazza di Spagna near the Spanish embassy. That's why it's called the Piazza di Spagna. And it is the Spanish ambassador's celebration of the name day of the Queen of Spain. And part of the celebration is a large procession and a musical concert. And that concert comprises a serenade, vocal music, and a concerto of 80 instruments. Now, let me show you those 80 instruments, just blowing up the image. There they are. So that the concerto, its ideal function is a grand celebratory one. When you want music to mark a particularly special occasion and you have the resources, the personnel and the instruments to do it, you gather up this many bodies, and that represents the gist of the concerto as it's emerging. But remember, Corelli is thinking further. Once you've got all of these players, it's not just having a big group, but creating a piece that contrasts different sonorities, or creating a piece that utilizes the effects of sonority created by these two groups, a small one and a large one. Now, while I'm on this image, for those of you who are either fans of Corelli or fans of the violin and its history, we've got portraits of Corelli, and I've already shown you one, but we don't have any pictures of Corelli playing the violin, and we wish we did, because as a violinist, he was just as influential in the development of violin playing, especially expressive ornamenting of the violin line. Corelli is hugely influential in just the history of violin playing and ornamenting. So we wish we knew how this guy actually played the violin. Well, we know that Corelli was leading this group, and we're reasonably certain that this group, led by Corelli, was playing his concertos. And if those two things are true, then the two small figures who are standing in front of the group are most certainly Corelli and his violin partner. These two, Corelli and Matteo Fornari, were playing together for some decades in Rome. So the figure on the left is probably Corelli, the leader of the first violins. The figure on the right is probably Matteo Fornari, the leader of the second violins. And what the violin historians get excited about, if all of these things are true, is how Corelli is holding the violin. He's holding it down at chest level, which the performance practice mavens of violin playing take careful note of and sometimes experiment with. This is going to change very quickly. Violinists are going to more and more have the instrument up on their shoulder. But this is the only evidence we have of Italian violin playing, at least by Corelli, in the 17th century. So I thought I would pause there for a long footnote. Let's get back to the concerto, and maybe just a little bit closer to the people and the pieces that you'll actually be hearing on this program. Corelli is not one of them. So Gemignani was a student of Corelli for a few years toward the end of Corelli's life. And then Gemignani left Italy to pursue his career in the British Isles. In London, he spent some time in Ireland, but that's where Gemignani went as a proponent of Italian violin music, and famously as one of Corelli's best students. This was Gemignani's claim to fame. He is disseminating Corellian violin playing and Corellian musical genres like the Concerto Grosso. So the piece that you do have on this program is Gemignani's arrangement. It's not an original composition. It is Gemignani's Concerto Grosso arrangement of what was originally a violin sonata by Corelli. So to give you an idea of what you get out of the Concerto Grosso arrangement, I'm going to play you a little bit of the violin sonata and then the same passage in its Concerto Grosso arrangement by Gemignani. So here's the violin piece. And in this recording, you will hear just violin and harpsichord. That's all we need. And I'll just point out that the harpsichord, on the one hand, is supplying accompaniment, the bass line and the harmonies that accompany the violin. However, the harpsichord part is also in dialogue with the violin. That is, there is motivic interest. That bass line has motivic or thematic interest in Corelli's conception. So it's not simply a violin sonata, it's a sonata for violin and continuo. And that idea, I believe, is important in understanding what Gemignani does in creating the Concerto Grosso form. I'll play it for you. So what Gemignani has done is at least a twofold operation. First, the solo violin is modestly expanded into a concertino. That is, in addition to the first violin, you actually have a second voice coming in there, a second violin. And those two are part of the concertino, the smaller ensemble. But then when Gemignani wants to draw our attention to the motivic interest in what was originally just the harpsichord continuo, that's when Gemignani brings in the Concerto Grosso, the larger ensemble. So that dialogue that I referred to between violin and continuo in Corelli's original sonata is now expanded into this dialogue between concertino and Concerto Grosso. But the fact of having small and large groups gives Gemignani a number of options as to how to translate the original dialogue between two players into a dialogue between, well, the concertino of three players and the Concerto Grosso of four parts of multiplied players. This actually affords him a number of options, but I just want to whet your appetite here as to what Gemignani is doing. So I'm not going to multiply examples to play for you. But this gives you the gist of the Concerto Grosso, how it works, what its attractions were, and how it might have been used in at least Corelli's own time. The Handel on the program is another or a further example of the Concerto Grosso. And in this case, the Handel, I mentioned this in the program notes, the Handel that you'll be hearing will be in an arrangement, a published arrangement by Handel, the composer himself, that is close to what you heard in Gemignani, and that is close to Corelli's own idea of a Concerto Grosso. Smaller ensemble, larger ensemble. But that Handel Concerto Grosso is actually a revised version of what originally was an organ concerto. That is, instead of concertino, a small ensemble, you had organ and accompanying orchestra. Handel then reworked his own piece into the Concerto Grosso format to illustrate the interest, the experiment simply in scoring possibilities. What Handel also gives you, and this is also mentioned in the program notes, what Handel gives us is a kind of shift in style, where Gemignani, on the basis of Corelli, is more purely Italianate in nature. Handel is a more international style composer. So there are movement types in the Handel that really reflect French practice as much as Italian practice. So Handel's writing a Concerto Grosso, but it is of a different style, even if the scoring principles are the same as what you get in Gemignani. Okay. Now, in the history of the Baroque concerto, really there are two main types, and I've been talking about one since we got into Corelli, and that one is the Concerto Grosso, and it's associated with Roman composers or students of Corelli after that. The other form of concerto is the so-called solo concerto. Sometimes it's known as the Venetian style of concerto. Sometimes it's just the Vivaldian style of concerto because he wrote so many of these pieces. And in this case, the workings of the genre still, they preserve this idea of a piece of music that draws our attention to scoring, that is, the groups, the ensemble or the bodies for which the music was written. The ensemble, interesting in and of itself. That idea is preserved in Vivaldi's Venetian style of concerto. What's different here, though, is in the working out of a contrast between distinct voices within the ensemble, Vivaldi is interested in assigning specific material to the larger group. That is, the larger group will now be distinguished not only by its size, but also by having thematically recurring material. The soloist now, not necessarily a concertino. In fact, usually the soloist in a Vivaldi concerto is one player, one person, one instrument. It can be two, it can be three or even four, but there is no fixed concertino of two violins and cello. Instead, there is one or more soloists who are distinguished from the tutti, not only by their relative fewness is not a word. So I've worked myself into a language corner. The soloists are not only distinguished by the fact that they're few in number and as few as one, but also by the fact that they are typically treating material that is non-thematic, that is improvisatory, spur of the moment, virtuosic solos is the material that's going to distinguish what the soloist or soloists are doing in Vivaldi, as opposed to the larger group, the tutti, the whole of the ensemble. And that whole ensemble is working thematically important material that is made important because it recurs throughout. So that's how a Vivaldi concerto works. There is an alternation between solos and tutti where you have non-thematic, improvisatory sounding solos and thematically important, thematically linked tuttis. The fact that you have returning thematic material in the tuttis gives the name ritornello, which is the Italian for refrain. Ritornello. The tuttis are playing ritornellos. And in fact, the larger form, the shape of the piece, the shape of the movements that Vivaldi is writing is called ritornello form. So a Vivaldi concerto often features just one soloist, but a movement type known as ritornello form, a refrain form. None of these things that I'm saying about the handling of thematic material applies to Corelli or Handel or Gemignani and the Concerto Grosso. No, this is one of the defining features of the Vivaldian or Venetian style of concerto. And as I did with Corelli in Rome and the Concerto Grosso, I want to say something about the use or original performing context of Vivaldi's concertos. Because if you were to get a works list of Antonio Vivaldi, you'll see that it's well, you'll see that he was a prolific composer. He composed, in addition to concertos, chamber music, operas, and oratorio. But the largest portion of his output is concertos, hundreds of them, hundreds and hundreds of concertos. So one of the things we have to account for is how he was composing so many of these pieces. And that's a matter of understanding how he poured his ideas into that ritornello form. He was just a font of different motifs, of different musical ideas, but he was able to produce so many pieces of music by organizing his ideas and channeling them within the ritornello form. But then the question is, well, why was he composing so many of these pieces? Beyond how, why? And this was related to his duties as head of instruments, and therefore instrumentalists, and sometimes chapel master, that is head of music, at the institution that you're looking at on the screen. Now, this is an 18th century watercolor that shows the church and the orphanage, or the ospedale as it was known, the ospedale of the Pietà. That is, the church and the orphanage were an institution run actually by the state of Venice, not the Catholic Church. The state of Venice ran this institution. That was a home for orphan daughters in the city and Republic of Venice. What it looks like today. Well, first, the church is post-Vivaldi. This is an 18th century church, but it was remodeled after Vivaldi's time. And then the complex of buildings of the orphanage itself, well, the main one that you saw in that 18th century watercolor is now a Venetian hotel. Still, we can peer into this institution and get some insight as to how this music was used and why it was so popular. So, as I was about to say, Vivaldi wrote so many of these concertos because, first, these were the pieces that he used to train the female instrumentalists in the Pietà, because part of the running of the institution required the church and maintaining the church's rituals, masses, vespers, important feast days. Worship in the church required music. Music required musicians. The musicians would have been singers and instrumentalists drawn from the membership of these orphan girls. Those who could be trained musically were. And Vivaldi was part of that training regime, mostly as someone training instrumentalists, because his job was head of instruments. So part of the training was Vivaldi writing music for these orphans. Concertos is often what he wrote. And what developed was something of a popular concert event, featuring these concertos in events, usually worship events, of the Pietà, attracted more and more attention, so that when we have illustrations of the Pietà and music making associated with the Pietà, they look very much like what we would think of as the modern concerto. This is not a church, it's a grand hall or a ballroom. But there they are on the left-hand side of the image, the figlie del coro, the daughters of the choir of the Pietà, that is, the orphans of the Pietà who were trained musically. And in this case, it looks like it's mostly an instrumental concerto, but in fact, the top row is singers, and then you have instrumentalists. And I can show you another image, again from the 18th century, of these daughters of the Pietà making music for a public audience, and more than that, for a public audience that is not in church and is not worshiping. Now, some qualifying needs to be, I need to do some qualifying here. This gives us a good idea of how Vivaldi's music was used, why there was such a demand on the part of the Pietà for concertos. This became written into his contract that he would continue to supply a certain number of concertos month by month, which is how we get to hundreds of concertos by the end of his life. However, the performing circumstances, this is what needs qualifying, because what you see in these images looks like a public concert, but we know that it couldn't quite have been this way, because the female performers themselves, for the sake of their modesty, were kept hidden away or distant so as to be practically invisible from a public audience. To do otherwise would have been scandalous by 18th century standards. And these paintings that I've shown you don't really capture that. If you were to study these paintings, you could see that the listeners aren't really looking at the performers, and that's accurate. But to get an idea of just how tucked away the performers would have been, we can look at Vivaldi's church, or the church that's standing where Vivaldi's church used to be, because it does preserve one important aspect, and that is these balconies. I've added the red arrows to show the balconies for the performers. And if you're sitting down in the nave, you can't see them. You can see where they are. And if you stood up on your tippy toes and got over to one side, then you could maybe see them. But you weren't to do that because they were to be out of sight in order to preserve their modesty as female performers in 18th century Venice. But this gives you an idea of how you could hear their music without seeing them. How it was that performances of Vivaldi's concertos and other pieces by these orphans became so popular in Venice as to become a tourist attraction. Note, I'll translate the title of this painting, Gabriele Bella's painting, a cantata of the girl orphans for the dukes of the North. And it's titled this because there was a Russian delegation that came to Venice in 1782, and they heard the Pietà orphans perform. And so it was commemorated in this painting. So this is how we know who was hearing this and about when. So we know that these performances are a kind of public event. We know that originally they were used in the church services of the Pietà. So this gives us an idea of how this music was originally used and then how it acquired a greater sort of concert importance or concert use for a broader public. But the performers were not to be seen. Now, the last thing that I want to do is to give you something of the music of this Venetian style of concerto. And I'm contrasting two fairly different pieces, but that fit within this concerto type, the Venetian type, the Vivaldian type, or the solo concerto, one by Vivaldi himself. Both of these pieces, by the way, are on your program. And the one by Vivaldi illustrates the musical distinctness between solo and tutti. They don't typically share material. Now, Vivaldi, he made all kinds of experiments in his ritornello form so that you can find some cases where motifs from the ritornello, from the tutti, from the orchestra, find their way into solos and vice versa. But oftentimes, the solo and the tutti are thematically distinct. They're each doing their own thing. Whereas, as you go forward with this Venetian type of solo concerto, as you go forward in history, the thematic relationship between solo and tutti begins to develop. And ultimately, they become so thematically close, solo and tutti, in the 18th century concerto, in the history of the concerto, that the genre is transformed from what it was. And Georg Matthias Mann shows us a point along that continuum, or a point along that development, in the development of a thematic relationship between tutti and solo. And that's what I want to illustrate with very quickly with two excerpts: the lack of a relationship between solo and tutti in Vivaldi and the development of one in Mann. Here goes. Now, I should have warned you, I made a cut there just so we could move from solo to tutti. But this is perhaps one of the most distinct examples, or one of the starkest examples of just how different solo and tutti material can be in a Vivaldi concerto. Now, the Mon. In this case, we'll start with the tutti, fade out, and then get the solo. Here goes. So what I'm intending for you to have heard in that Mon excerpt is that the soloist's point of departure is the main theme that you heard in the tutti. And then I let it go on a little bit because, as I say, it's the point of departure. Then the soloist will go off in his own direction with improvisatory, often virtuosic sounding material. So there is very much a relationship between what Mon is doing and what Vivaldi had done. They're both working under the umbrella of the ritornello form. But as you go forward in the 18th century with the solo concerto, thematic coherence becomes more and more of a concern. And that's the last thing that I wanted to say. So I've taken up about 40 minutes of your time. And Brian, I return the MC duties to you.
Well, thank you so much, Greg, for all of your fantastic insights, as always. And thank you, everyone, so much for joining us. We're looking forward to Saturday night's concert. We hope to welcome you from your living rooms as you stream the concert live. So until next time, we hope that you have a great afternoon, stay warm, and we'll see you on Saturday for some great music. Thank you all very much. Thanks,
Greg.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.